The 52nd floor of the Hartwell Tower had a particular kind of silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of dread, the kind that settles over a room when everyone present understands, without needing to say it aloud, that something irreversible may already be in motion. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched in every direction, indifferent and glittering. Inside, 14 people stood or sat around a glass-topped conference table, and not one of them wanted to be the first to speak. Victoria Hargrove stood at the far end of the table, her back half turned to the room. She was 36 years old and had not reached this floor by accident. She had built Hargrove Capital Systems from a 3-person operation in a rented office in Midtown into one of the most closely watched fintech firms in the country, a company whose core asset was not its people, not its brand, but the proprietary AI engine it had spent 4 years and $400 million developing, an engine that, for the past 72 hours, had been behaving like a compass needle near a magnet, spinning, erratic, producing outputs that bore no reliable relationship to reality. The losses were still being tallied. The preliminary figure stood at $230 million. That number would grow before it stopped. Victoria's phone had not been quiet in 3 days. Her lead investor, a man named Gregory Faulkner who ran a sovereign wealth fund out of Singapore, had called 11 times. She had answered twice. The conversations had been short and clinical. The way conversations between professionals become when the pleasantries have been permanently stripped away by circumstance. The model predicted a 12.4% correction in the pharmaceutical index, said Marcus Webb, her chief technology officer. From somewhere behind her, the actual movement was 2.1% in the opposite direction. That was the 4th consecutive misprediction of that magnitude. We're not looking at noise anymore. I know what we're looking at, Marcus. Her voice was flat and very quiet. She had a way of making softness feel like pressure. The rollback failed, Marcus continued. He was 42 and had a habit of explaining things slowly when he was frightened, as if the pace of his words might slow the pace of events. The backup model produces the same outputs, which means the error isn't in the prediction layer, or if it is, it's being fed by something upstream. Something upstream, she repeated. That's a technical term. It means we don't know where it's coming from. She turned then, finally, and looked at the room. 14 faces, engineers, data scientists, 2 quants from the trading desk who had been brought in overnight. A risk analyst whose eyes had the particular redness of someone who had not slept in longer than they were willing to admit. These were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily capable people. She had hired them carefully and paid them well. She had trusted them with the most sensitive systems her company owned. 24 hours, she said. After 24 hours, the position we're holding becomes unhedgeable. We either fix the system by then, or we begin a controlled wind-down, which will take 18 months, cost us most of what remains, and destroy the reputation we have spent 4 years building. The room absorbed this without visible reaction. I'll say it plainly, Victoria continued. There will be $10 million for whoever identifies and resolves the core error. Not the team. One person. The one who actually finds it. This produced a different kind of silence, not the silence of dread, but the silence of recalibration. Money has a specific sound when it lands, even when no one says anything. $10 million, Marcus said. I know what it is. She looked at him with a steadiness that ended the sentence. Bring in anyone. Contractor, academic, freelancer. I don't care. Put it on every secure channel you have access to. We have 24 hours. She picked up her phone and walked toward the glass partition at the far end of the room, and the meeting, such as it was, dissolved into the sound of keyboards and lowered voices. By the time the 3rd day settled into its evening hours, the whiteboard along the north wall of the 48th floor, a secondary workspace that Marcus had commandeered for the crisis response, had been erased and rewritten so many times that the surface had taken on a permanent gray haze. The team had tried everything in sequence, and then several things simultaneously. They had attempted a rollback to the previous stable build. The rollback produced the same error signature, which meant the fault was either deeper than the build version or present in something the build drew from. They had attempted to surgically isolate the prediction module and run it against clean synthetic data. The predictions were accurate on clean data. They had attempted to replicate the error in a sandboxed environment and could not. This was perhaps the most unsettling finding. An error that appeared consistently in the live system, but vanished when that system was examined closely, had the quality of something alive. Devin Strickland, the lead ML architect, had been awake for 31 hours. He sat in front of 3 monitors, his coffee untouched, and stared at a diagnostic panel that told him what he already knew. The model's internal states were consistent and valid. The math was correct. The architecture was sound. Something was wrong, but it was not here. "It's not the model," he said, to no one in particular. For approximately the 7th time that day. "We've established that," said Priya, a data engineer who had arrived from the London office on a red-eye, and now occupied a corner desk with the focused stillness of someone who had made a decision, and was waiting to see if they were right. "What we haven't established," said Priya, "is what's feeding it." This was the question no one wanted to look at directly. Not because they hadn't thought of it, but because it implied a fault in the infrastructure layer, a layer that had been designed and maintained separately from the AI system itself, and that no one in the current room was primarily responsible for. There was a particular human tendency, in crisis situations, to focus attention on the systems one understood best, and this team understood the model very well. They understood the infrastructure somewhat less. Marcus moved through the floor every 40 minutes or so. Not because there was anything useful he could do, but because stillness felt dangerous. He had called 3 external consulting firms and an academic research group. All had provided advice. None had provided a solution. The $10 million offer had been circulated through 3 channels. 12 people had responded. 2 had been credentialed and granted access. Both had spent several hours in the system and produced nothing actionable. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus stood at the window and looked at the city below, and he thought, though he would not have said this to anyone, that they were not going to fix this in time. The maintenance office on the 14th floor of Hartwell Tower was a narrow room with good lighting and a window that faced another building's brick wall. It smelled like lubricating oil and coffee, both of which were present in visible form on most of the horizontal surfaces. There was a small whiteboard on which job orders were written in marker and crossed off, and a coat rack near the door with 2 jackets on it, and a short bookshelf with a row of technical manuals and, on the far end, somewhat incongruously, 3 well-worn books about marine biology. Caleb Rhodes worked the day shift. He was 38 years old, and he was the kind of man who was easy to overlook and difficult, once you had actually looked, to forget. Medium height, broad shoulders, dark hair going gray at the temples in the specific way that happens when a person has been tired for a long time. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them, not rough, exactly, but certain. His face was composed in the particular way of people who have learned to keep their reactions close. He had been at Hartwell Tower for 2 years and 3 months. He was, by any objective measure, an excellent maintenance technician. He repaired things accurately and without drama. He noticed problems before they became failures, which was a more valuable quality than it sounded. He was liked by the building staff and had a nodding acquaintance with several dozen other people in the tower, which was the appropriate social architecture for his position. What very few people in the building knew, and what almost no one in the tower's upper floors would have thought to consider, was that Caleb Rhodes had, some years before, held a different kind of job entirely. He had completed a doctoral program at MIT at the age of 26, specializing in adaptive learning systems and data preprocessing methodology. He had spent the following 3 years at a research institution in Boston doing work that he had found genuinely meaningful, building models that were not designed to make money but to understand complex behavior in interconnected systems. Then a firm had hired him for what had been presented as ethical AI development. It had not been that. The request had come in a meeting, from a man who smiled when he spoke. Modify the risk weighting algorithm so that certain categories of debt were systematically undervalued before being passed to regulators. Just a small adjustment, technically defensible, genuinely undetectable. Caleb had said no. He had said it calmly and without elaboration, which was his way. and the consequences had been predictable and thorough. Not dramatic, no dramatic scenes, no confrontation, nothing that could be pointed to as retaliation. Just a series of doors that closed, references that went unreturned, positions that were filled by someone else, an industry that was smaller than it looked. He had a daughter to raise alone, and so he had made a practical decision and moved in a different direction, and he had been, by most measures, fine. Her name was Lily. She was 6 years old and had her father's eyes and a way of watching the world that reminded him, sometimes uncomfortably, of himself at a similar age. She was curious about most things and excellent at identifying when someone was pretending to be more certain than they were. She attended a school 3 blocks from their apartment, and Caleb dropped her off every morning at 8 and picked her up at 3. And on the days when the math worked, they stopped at the bakery on Clement Street for something small before heading home. This was the life he had built. It was not large, but it was honest, and honesty, he had decided, was worth more than it was generally priced. On the morning of the 4th day of the crisis on the 52nd floor, the school called. A pipe had broken in one of the lower classrooms. The building was fine. No one was hurt. But they were closing early for the day while the maintenance crew worked. And could parents or guardians please arrange pickup by noon? Caleb received the message at 11:15 and spent 3 minutes organizing his day in his head before going to his supervisor, a reasonable man named Harris, and explaining the situation. Harris told him to take the afternoon. Lily was waiting by the front gate in her blue jacket, her backpack almost as large as she was, looking pleased about the unexpected development in the way that 6-year-olds can find pleasure in most disruptions to routine. There was water on the hallway floor, she told him, with the authority of someone who had observed something significant. Quite a lot. I believe you. Are we going to the bakery? It's 11:30. That's not a no. It was not. They went to the bakery, and then, because Caleb had a job order to close out in the tower, a HVAC calibration on the 31st floor that he had started the previous afternoon, he brought Lily with him, which he had done perhaps half a dozen times before. She knew the security desk staff by name. They let her sign herself in, which she enjoyed. In the elevator, on the way up, Lily noticed the printout on the board near the building directory. It had been placed there at some point in the past 12 hours, a simple notice, the kind that building management sometimes posted for awareness. Notice to all building contractors and staff. Hargrove Capital Systems, 4853F, is conducting an emergency technical review. All qualified data systems personnel interested in consultation opportunities should contact Ext 5200. Caleb read it the way he read most things, completely, and without showing that he was doing so. The elevator reached 31. The doors opened. Lily looked up at him. She had a habit of understanding things she hadn't been told. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong. You went quiet." "I'm often quiet." "Different quiet," she said, and stepped out of the elevator. He completed the calibration in 40 minutes, with Lily sitting on the bench near the equipment room reading a book about sea turtles that she had brought from her backpack. When he finished and they were back in the elevator, going down, she said, "What was on the sign?" He considered not answering. He answered, "A company upstairs is having trouble with their computer system. They're looking for someone to help fix it. Can you fix it?" "I don't know. Probably not." She looked at him the way she sometimes did, level, unhurried, with a patience that felt borrowed from someone older. "That means maybe. It means I don't know." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Lily stepped out, then turned back and looked at him from the lobby. "You know how you always say don't ignore things you notice?" she asked. He stepped out of the elevator. "Yes. You noticed the sign." He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the directory board near the security desk, where the extension number was printed clearly at the bottom of the notice. He picked up his phone and called it. The woman who met him at the elevator bank on 48 was named Claire, and she was polite in the efficient way of someone managing several things at once and doing each of them adequately. She had not expected him to look the way he looked. She did not say this, but he had enough experience reading rooms to understand it from the brief pause when she turned and saw his clothes: maintenance pants, a plain navy shirt, boots. The 48th floor was busy in a specific way, the kind of busy that had been ongoing long enough that it no longer felt urgent, just relentless. People moved with the careful energy of those conserving what they had left. She brought him to the door of the main workspace and stopped there. "I'll need to let Marcus Webb know you're here. He's the CTO. He's been managing the technical response. Okay, can you tell me your background?" "For the log. I have a doctorate in adaptive learning systems. I worked in machine learning research for about 3 years after that." A small hesitation. "And now?" "Building maintenance." The hesitation became something more visible. She recovered quickly. "One moment." Marcus Webb was a tall man who carried his height with a slight forward lean, as if walking into a headwind. He came to the door and looked at Caleb with the specific expression of a person who had been awake too long and had stopped pretending that their patience was infinite. "You saw the notice," Marcus said. "Yes. What's your background?" Caleb told him. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was either professionalism or exhaustion. It was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. "We've had 12 inquiries," Marcus said. 2 people were granted access. Neither helped. "Understood. The system is proprietary. You'd be working under an NDA. "Understood." From somewhere behind Marcus, a voice. "Give him 5 minutes." They both turned. Victoria Hargrove had appeared at the edge of the workspace. She was standing with her arms crossed and looking at Caleb with an expression that was not warm, exactly, but was not dismissive either. It was the expression of someone who had developed, out of necessity, the ability to look at information without deciding in advance what it was. Marcus looked back at Caleb. 5 minutes, he said, as if this were his own decision. "You can look at the diagnostic panel. If you have something useful to say, say it." Caleb looked at Marcus, then briefly at Victoria, and then he said, "Okay." He did not say thank you. It was not ingratitude. It was the particular dignity of someone who understood that the conversation they were having was not about courtesy. A few heads lifted as he walked into the room. He was used to being somewhere that he did not, at first glance, appear to belong. He had been used to this for a long time. He stood in front of the diagnostic panel for 45 seconds without touching anything, which was longer than most people in the room were comfortable with. Someone, one of the quants, a young man named Bradley, who had been there since the beginning, said something under his breath that was too low to hear but had the rhythm of mockery. Caleb did not respond to this. "Can I see the raw log?" he asked. His voice was level, directed at no one in particular. Not the diagnostic summary, the raw input log, before it reaches the pre-processing stage. Devon, the ML architect, looked up from his screen. "Why?" "I want to see the data before the model touches it. We've checked the model." "The model is..." "I know. That's why I want to see what comes before it." A pause. Devon glanced at Marcus, who was standing in the doorway. Marcus gave a small nod, the kind that communicated, "Let him." Devon pulled up the raw log and rotated his monitor a few degrees. Caleb stepped closer and looked at it. He did not ask for a chair. He leaned slightly forward, hands at his sides, and read. The room continued its background noise keystrokes. One quiet phone call in the corner. The low hum of equipment. 90 seconds passed. Then Caleb said, "There." Devon looked at where he was indicating, a column of timestamps. "What about them?" "The offset," Caleb said. "The timestamps from your market data feed are running 3.7 milliseconds ahead of your internal system clock. It's been doing it consistently. Look at this sequence here and here. Your pre-processing module is treating concurrent events as sequential because the timestamps tell it they happened in order. But they didn't. 2 of the input signals it's treating as cause and effect were actually simultaneous. The room had gone quiet, not the silence of the beginning that had been dread. This was a different quality of silence. The silence of people who are listening because they can tell the thing being said might be true. "That's a timestamp synchronization issue," Devon said slowly. "That's straightforward to fix." Caleb was already looking at the log more carefully. "You'd resync the feed to UTC with NTP discipline. Then add a jitter tolerance window in the pre-processing step. 3 lines, maybe 4. The model itself doesn't need to change. If you're right about the cause, run the log through a temporal ordering check. If the input sequence reorients correctly after resync, you'll know within a few minutes. Devon was already typing. The room had fully oriented toward this. Marcus had stepped fully inside and was standing near the center, watching. Victoria had not moved from where she stood near the door. The check ran. It took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When the result appeared on Devon's screen, he sat back in his chair and made a sound that was not quite a word. The log, once resynchronized, produced a coherent temporal sequence. The events that the model had been treating as leading indicators were, in reality, concurrent. The predictions had not been wrong because the model was broken. They had been wrong because the model had been given a distorted account of when things happened. Devon turned to his keyboard. His hands moved with the speed of someone who understood exactly what they were doing now that they had been shown the direction. The fix took 11 minutes. When the system came back up, the first prediction it generated was accurate to within 0.3%. The room did not erupt. It absorbed. This was, in itself, a kind of testament to the people in it that they understood the difference between the moment of discovery and the confirmation of resolution, and they waited for the latter before reacting to either. The second prediction came through. Accurate. The third. Accurate. Devon ran a back test against the past 72 hours of market data, the same period during which the system had failed, and watched the recalibrated model produce, in retrospect, what the correct predictions would have been. He said nothing. He turned the monitor so that Marcus could see. Marcus stood very still for a moment. Caleb had stepped back from the workstation and was standing near the edge of the room. He had his hands in his pockets. He was looking out the window at the city. The same city Victoria had been looking at from the same floor 3 days ago, and his face held the particular composure of someone who had arrived at an answer they were not entirely surprised by. Bradley, the young quant who had said something under his breath earlier, was now looking at his own desk. Victoria crossed the room. She stood in front of Caleb, not quite close. And she looked at him in a way that she did not often look at people without the usual layer of professional assessment between her and what she was actually seeing. It was a timestamp synchronization problem, she said. Yes, our entire team missed it. They were looking at the right things, he said. The model, the architecture, those were solid. The error was upstream of all of it, in a layer that doesn't usually cause this kind of downstream effect. It's an easy thing to not think to look for. This was not, she noticed, magnanimity. It was accuracy. He was describing the situation correctly. You found it in under 2 minutes, she said. I've seen something like it before. Different context. The signature was similar. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" "Caleb Rhodes." She nodded once, the way people nod when they are filing something away. "Thank you, Mr. Rhodes." "You're welcome." Victoria Hargrove had an ability she would not have called it a talent, because she did not think of useful capacities as talents, so much as habits that had been refined to locate information quickly and read it without the interpretive layer that most people unconsciously applied. She looked at facts, she evaluated them, and she arrived at conclusions that were separate from what she wanted to be true. She spent 2 hours that evening, after the system had been confirmed stable and her investors had been briefed, and the immediate crisis had dissolved into the specific relief that follows sustained catastrophe, learning about Caleb Rhodes. There was not a great deal publicly available. He had published 3 papers during and immediately after his doctoral work. She found them on an academic repository, read the abstracts, and then read the papers themselves, which she did not entirely understand, but understood enough to confirm that they were serious work. The citations were consistent with a researcher who had made a genuine contribution to a specific and narrow field. The employment history between his research position and his current role was sparse in the way that gaps in a resume often are when there is something behind the gap that the person has chosen not to explain. She did not look for the explanation online. Instead, she picked up her phone and called a person she trusted, a woman named Frances Alderman, who had worked in technology ethics consulting for many years and knew most of the significant figures in the field, and she described what she knew about Caleb's trajectory and asked whether Frances had heard the name. Frances had. She told Victoria what she knew, which was partial but coherent. A researcher who had been offered a position that asked for something that crossed a line, who had declined, and who had subsequently found that the specific industry he worked in had a memory for such decisions. Not punishment, Precisely nothing as legible as that. Just the slow, aggregate effect of closed doors. He has a daughter, Francis said. I think he's raising her on his own. I don't know the full story. Victoria sat with this for a while after the call ended. She had built her company by understanding systems, not just the mathematical systems that her AI modeled, but the human systems that determined who succeeded and who did not, what was rewarded and what was discouraged. She was, in the ordinary way of people who are very good at something, clear-eyed about the incentive structures that governed her field, including the ones she participated in and perpetuated. She had made decisions she was not entirely proud of. She had made compromises that she had justified to herself in the language of practicality. She was not naive about this, but she had also, she believed, maintained a floor, a level below which she would not go. Certain things she would not ask of people who worked for her. What she was understanding now, sitting in her quiet office at 9 in the evening, with the city outside, and the fixed star of the solved problem somewhere behind her, was that a man who had maintained that same floor, who had found it and held it, even at significant personal cost, had walked into her building carrying a child and an old pair of boots, and solved in 12 minutes what her team of experts had been unable to solve in 72 hours. She did not feel grateful exactly. Gratitude was too simple. She felt something more like recognition. She called Marcus. Pull his contract details, she said. I need his phone number, for the payment, for a conversation. He met her the following morning. Not in the tower. He had suggested a coffee shop 3 blocks away, a quiet place with good light, and she had agreed, which had surprised the assistant she had asked to arrange it. She was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table with a coffee she had not touched. He sat across from her and ordered tea, which the server brought quickly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This was not awkward. They were both people who were comfortable with the beginning of a conversation rather than immediately filling it. The system is stable, she said. We've been running clean for 18 hours. The backtest is consistent. Good. We owe you $10 million. He looked at his tea. I'd like to talk about that. She had expected this not because she had assumed he would refuse, but because she had come to understand, from what she'd learned, that he was not someone who made decisions the obvious way. I'm listening, she said. I don't need $10 million, he said. I don't have a use for it. I have a daughter and I have a job and I have a life that's basically fine. What I need, specifically, is about $800,000. He said this without embarrassment, which she respected. There's a house I've been looking at for the past year. It's in a good school district. It has a yard. I've been doing the math on what's realistic. And that's the number I'm actually short. She looked at him. You fixed a $10 million problem, and you want $800,000 for a house. Yes, that's the rest, he said. I'd want to give to a fund that supports early career researchers who are dealing with ethical pressure in their positions. People who are in the situation I was in, without the means to absorb the cost of saying no. There are more of them than people think. She was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this, she said. I had some time this morning. She looked at him carefully, not the professional evaluation she applied to most people, but something more direct. Why tell me where you want the rest to go? You could take the 10 million and do whatever you wanted with it. I'm telling you because you might be in a position to structure it in a way that has more impact than I could manage on my own. And because he paused, briefly, in the way of someone choosing the accurate word rather than the polite one, I think you understand, better than most people in your position, what it costs to say no to the wrong thing. This landed, as he'd perhaps known it would. She picked up her coffee. I'll transfer the $800,000 today, she said. And I'd like to talk to you about the structure for the rest. There are ways to set something like that up that have longevity. I'd appreciate that. I also want to ask you something. Go ahead. I'm not going to offer you a job, she said. I think you know why you don't want one. And I think your reasons are good. But I have a systems problem, not the one you fixed, a different one, a Shawoo's and longer-term one, and I don't have anyone who thinks about it the way you think about it. I'd like to consult with you, on your terms, your schedule, from wherever you are. No title, no office, no hierarchy, just a phone call when I need it. He looked at her across the table. You can say no, she said. I won't hold it against you. I know, he said. Yes, that's fine. She held out her hand across the table. He took it. The handshake was brief and definitive, the kind that closes something and opens something simultaneously. The house was on a quiet street in a neighborhood where the sidewalks were wide, and the elementary school was 4 blocks away, and the library Lily had already identified this as a critical factor, was within walking distance. It had a porch, which Caleb had not thought he cared about and discovered he did when he saw one again, and a yard with a large tree in it that was old enough to have weathered a significant number of storms. The closing took several weeks. During that time, Caleb continued his work at Hartwell Tower, finished his outstanding job orders, and gave Harris 2 weeks' notice delivered with the same lack of drama with which he approached most things. Harris shook his hand and said he was sorry to see him go and meant it. On the Saturday after the move, Lily stood in the backyard in the morning light and turned slowly in a circle, looking at the fence, the tree, the sky above, the house behind her. She had a way of formally acknowledging new things, a kind of private ceremony of attention. It's good, she said, with the seriousness of a declaration. Good. The tree is old. Yes. We should know its name. She meant the species. She was particular about the names of living things. We'll look it up. She nodded, satisfied, and went inside to see what the kitchen looked like from inside on a day that was theirs. The fund, which eventually was called the Clear Signal Fund, a name that Caleb chose because it was accurate and because he liked the double meaning, was established through a foundation that Victoria's legal team helped structure. It provided grants to early career researchers in data systems and AI who faced documented ethical pressure in their positions and needed financial support to make independent decisions. The application process was simple by design. Caleb reviewed the applications himself, in the evenings, at his kitchen table, with tea. The first cohort was 11 people. One of them, a woman named Diana Cho, had been asked to misrepresent the training data for a medical diagnostic system and had refused. The grant gave her 6 months to find a position that didn't require that of her. She found one. Victoria called him on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, about 6 weeks after the move. He was on the porch, making notes about something she'd sent him, a systems architecture question she was considering for a new product. Lily was in the yard, throwing a ball against the fence in a patient, repetitive way that seemed to satisfy something in her. The fund received 14 new applications this week, Victoria said. I know. I'm working through them. I want to add another $2 million to the endowment. That's your money. It's a cause worth funding. And a pause. It was your idea. The idea was yours too, he said. You just needed someone to make it specific. She was quiet for a moment on the other end. He had noticed that she was a person who was more comfortable with directness in conversation than with the recognition of her own better impulses. He did not remark on this. He simply let the silence hold what it held. The architecture question I sent you, she said. Have you had a chance to look at it? Yes. And? Your proposed solution will work, but it has the same vulnerability as before. It assumes temporal consistency in your upstream feeds. You'll want to build in a validation step before anything hits the pre-processing layer. I can write it up. Please. He made a note. Lily threw the ball against the fence. It came back. I'll send you something by the end of the week, he said. Thank you, Caleb. You're welcome, Victoria. He set the phone down and leaned back in the porch chair and looked at the yard. The tree was a red oak, which they had looked up on the second day. Lily had been pleased by this information. Red oaks, she had subsequently learned, could live for 500 years. She had told him this at dinner, with the expression of someone sharing something important, which it was. There is a thing that happens in complex systems, not just the mathematical kind, but the human kind, where a small hidden error, early in a process, compounds quietly over time, accumulating consequence, until the consequence becomes too large to ignore. The error itself may be almost invisible. A few milliseconds. A misaligned assumption. A decision made in a moment of pressure that seemed, at the time, small enough to absorb. Caleb had thought about this for a long time. He had thought about it in the specific technical sense, because that was his training, and he had also thought about it in the larger sense, because thinking was something he did regardless of whether he meant to. The system he'd been asked to corrupt, years ago, had been a small adjustment. That was how it had been presented. A few parameters shifted slightly. No one would know. The downstream effect, his employer had implied, was negligible. But downstream effects in systems that touch many people's lives are rarely negligible. They compound. They create predictions that steer decisions that shape realities. The error in Victoria's system had been a 3.7 millisecond offset, invisible. And yet, he did not think of himself as a person who had made a heroic choice. He had made the only choice he could make and remain someone his daughter could look at directly. That was the full extent of it. On an evening in late October, when the air had turned cold and the oak tree in the yard had gone the color of fire, Caleb was fixing the back door, which had developed a subtle warp in the frame over the preceding weeks. It was the kind of problem that was easy to ignore and would eventually become expensive if ignored long enough. He was shimming the hinge, taking his time, working with the particular patience of someone who understood that a repair done correctly once was worth significantly more than the same repair done quickly. Lily appeared in the doorway above him. "Dinner," she said. 5 minutes. She looked at what he was doing with the evaluative interest she brought to most things. "Is it fixed?" "Almost." He set the shim, checked the alignment, swung the door gently. It closed. "True. Now," he said. She stepped aside to let him in. The kitchen was warm, and the light was the particular yellow of kitchens in the early evening in autumn, and there was pasta on the stove that Lily had learned to make from a cookbook she had selected herself from the library's cooking section. She was extremely serious about pasta. She had opinions about sauce that she expressed without apology. He washed his hands at the sink and looked out the window at the yard, where the oak tree stood in the last light. He was not, he thought, living the life he had imagined when he was 25 and full of the specific optimism of a person who has been told they are gifted. That life had involved different rooms and different achievements and a different kind of visibility. He was living a life that was, on most measurable dimensions, smaller. But measurement was a function of the units you chose, and he had come to prefer the units he had now. The warmth of a kitchen, the sound of his daughter taking dinner seriously, the satisfying click of a door that swung true on its hinges, the calls from Victoria on Tuesday afternoons, which had become, without either of them planning it, something he looked forward to, the applications that arrived each week for the fund, each one a person standing at a line they were unwilling to cross, needing to know that someone would help hold that line with them. He had not fixed the system because of the money. He had fixed it because it was broken, and he could see how, and the answer was straightforward once you looked in the right place. He had built the fund because the problem it addressed was real and persistent, and nobody was solving it with the specificity it required. He had said yes to Victoria's consulting request because the work was interesting and the terms were honest, and those were, in the end, the only terms he trusted. Lily set 2 plates on the table. "Sit," she said. She was very emphatic about meals at the table. He sat. She served the pasta with the concentration of someone performing a task that mattered, because she had decided it did. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree in the last of the light, and the old branches held. The largest failures begin with the smallest misalignments. A few milliseconds. A single compromised assumption. A decision made in the space between what is convenient and what is true. Caleb Rhodes had learned this early, and he had paid for knowing it, and he had, in the end, kept the thing that the knowing cost him, which was not a career or a salary or a name in the right circles, but the quieter thing, the ability to look at a broken system and find where it started to go wrong, and fix it, and mean it.